for good or ill. But thank you. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Before we begin, I need to apologize if my preparation and mental acuity seem even lower than my norm. As it turns out, I took a COVID test on Thursday and I won the jackpot. That is what it means, isn't it, when the two lines appear bold as brass? Like 5 cherries or whatever it is on the slot machines. I've always tested reasonably well, so maybe that's it. In any case, though, I have, I think, made considerable progress since then, thanks to having previously fortified myself with, 4 or 5 vaccinations in the series, and also having contacted a doctor and started on Paxlovid a few hours later. I'm still probably not, as we say in our house, flying on all thrusters. As it turns out, it's a slightly mangled reference to Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. Speaking of the newly restored from oblivion and mentally addled Mr. Spock, Dr. McCoy says he's not exactly working on all thrusters. I expect COVID will run its course, foreshortened and not too bad. I'm feeling immeasurably better already. With luck, I've tested negative twice by the middle of the week and can rejoin our merry band on Sunday, in keeping with the latest CDC recommendations. If not, of course, well, we'll consider that when it comes. In any case, in this online setting, my preaching, even with a full viral load, poses no risk to you other than, any risk you might encounter from the actual content of the sermon. Unfortunately, there is no at-home or even clinical test for heresy or downright stupidity, and while I might hope to avoid both, there you need to be wary on your own. So, to the readings. As often with lectionary, there are 2 lessons that are either thematically or historically about the same general topic, and one that's apparently about something else. I've never quite figured out whether that's a mercy or a challenge. Either the makers of the lectionary were trying to provide an escape route for the preacher who didn't really want to preach on the topic of the 2 parallel readings, or else it was set as a puzzle for those who are eager to find the hidden connection between all 3. I'm of that perverse disposition that likes to look for some connection anyway, but I confess that this may be a pathology and one harder to get rid myself of than a case of COVID. It may also just be an artifact of my underlying assumption that everything is sooner or later actually connected. Not only is everyone and everything only 6 degrees of separation from someone important, Kevin Bacon or not, but also from the production of quince paste, social engineerings, and classic chess openings. It's almost an article of faith for me, though I'm not quite ready to stage an academic defense for the position. In real-world terms, my usual policy here has been to figure out what I prefer to preach about from among the available options, while always furtively looking around for a way to rope in the other pieces. Sometimes I find it, sometimes I don't. If I were a physicist, I'd be the guy looking for the way to reduce Maxwell's equations, there are, as I understand it, 4, to one perfect equation, but not the guy smart enough to pull it off for real. So, I've always found the calling of Abraham a fascinating episode in the Genesis narrative, since it's obviously a key to much of the rest of the unfolding narrative of the Old Testament. With the extended promise to Abraham and his progeny, it's the anchor point of a completely redefined relationship between God and his people, signaled by the pointed renaming not only of Abram only, but Sarai too, as Abraham and Sarah. It emphasizes the important fact, which you should still remember, that for that relationship to change, the actual change, all of it really, has to be not on God's part, since God is generally acknowledged to be unchanging, but in them. God's name does not change, though he will subsequently be referred to as occasionally as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as anyone who's been around the Book of Common Prayer knows. They've received a new set of marching orders, and their destiny and their heritage has been enlarged in unimaginable ways. The unfolding of that transformation drives the rest of Genesis, and in a larger sense, the whole of the Old Testament, and it is carried over into the New. The Romans passage picks up on that and runs with it in some kind of perplexing ways. Paul clearly sees a connection between Abraham's transformation by faith and the situation of the modern, for him, Christian believer. Our relationship with God is, as we've noted before, not a matter of passing a test in theology. It's about being a member of God's family. Me. The Jews became God's family. Within that family, God seems to have put up with a lot of wayward thinking and doing, even if he later had to be fairly hard on them from time to time. The same is true with Christians. If Paul has a single unambiguous message in Romans, and Martin Luther certainly thought he did, it's that we can't even begin to earn our way to salvation. It just doesn't work that way. On that calculus, we come out as losers 100% of the time. The connection between those two readings is really rather intriguing, but for all that I find them intriguing, having thought about them for several days in a row, I didn't come up with much of anything interesting to say about them other than to point out how they're connected. It doesn't mean that there isn't anything to be said, merely that I, perhaps restricted by my own obstinacy, wasn't discovering it. That's the trick with sermons, though. Not only are you supposed to be interested in the passages in question, but you're supposed to say something interesting about them. If not, it's more a matter of nothing more to see here, move along. So I looked further to the passage from the Gospel of Mark. For whatever reason, this is the one that seemed to pop for me today. On the face of it, this is one of the more disturbing pieces of the gospel narrative. The situation seems simple. Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to have to undergo great suffering, be rejected by all the people in power, be put to death, and rise again on the third day. Mark points out that he says this quite openly, an interesting detail, if only because it would never have occurred to me, at least, that he would have done it any other way. But then Peter takes him aside and begins to chide him, at which point Jesus replies in kind, saying, "Get me behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." The story is also related in Matthew's Gospel. Interestingly, it is not in Luke's, which tends to expatiate on such personal exchanges more than normal. It's also not recounted in John, but then again, many things are not to be found in John. John is always operating on a different wavelength. The repetition of the story in Matthew has a few other details. It gives a little more of the conversation filled in. Here's that bit. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." I'm not sure what to make of the fact. I should point out that in the Mark version, he's looking at the other disciples, and in this one, he's looking at Peter. But maybe that's just noise. We're probably so accustomed to hearing about this incident, though, that we don't consider just how odd it is. In most contexts, one would assume that, sticking up for Jesus and expressing a wish that he should not die would be at least considered a good thing. It puts Peter in Jesus's corner, at least, doesn't it? We're unequivocally taught throughout that Jesus's prosecution and execution were illegal, immoral, and wrong. Wouldn't opposing it be righteous, moral, and correct? Of course it would. But it is so in purely human terms, as Jesus explains. But as so often with our lectionary, this weirdly bitter exchange is torn out of context. Two contextual things are worth recalling here before we go deciding too glibly what the whole thing is really pointing at. Ignoring context is always dangerous, and I think modern Christians, especially those given to proof texting, have taken a good deal too much license to do so. First, we need to note what comes before it. This comes immediately after the confession of Peter in both of the gospel accounts. Only a few verses later, in response to the challenge, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter has given the momentous observation, unanticipated by anyone else, apparently, "You are the Messiah." Again, wordier, but not really any more revealing. In Matthew, his response is reported as, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Same difference, though I confess the Matthew version sounds cooler. So Peter has, in a sense, just hit a grand slam. He has realized and articulated for the rest of the group what nobody else has quite been able to articulate up to this time. From there on, it becomes part of their common discourse. If that's at all in doubt, it's made explicit in the very next verse in Mark and in Matthew 4 verses later, where Jesus orders the disciples not to tell anyone that he's the Messiah. So clearly they've all heard it now and know what Peter has said. Then, of course, we get to today's disembodied passage. In it, Peter attempts to dissuade Jesus from following the course he has to follow, and Jesus rebukes him in the sternest possible terms. It's alarming and shockingly personal, from wholehearted acceptance at one moment to almost violent rejection at the next. Where Jesus has identified Peter as the one to whom this remarkable revelation has come in warm and intimate terms, he's now pushing him away as his enemy and tempter. Some of this is just dramatic writing, I guess. In storytelling, the sudden turnaround is part of what makes things go. But on the assumption that this also reflects what actually happened, and why and how it happened, I think it's worth looking for the deeper rationale. In a sense, Peter is able to tempt Jesus in part because of the connection that has grown between them. Peter has uniquely seen through to the core of Jesus' identity, and that puts him in a unique relationship with Jesus. But now he is in a position to exercise more influence, so to speak, over Jesus. And with that comes a greater mutual vulnerability. Immediately, therefore, the new boundaries need to be established. In spite of his recognition of Jesus, he must not be allowed to deflect him from his ultimate purpose. So, against the background of the confession of Peter, this is, I think, momentously changed. But it also needs to be pointed out that this is not the end of the line for that relationship. This is not a final rejection of Peter, like Prince Hal's frigid rejection of Falstaff at the end of Henry IV, Part 2. Largely because of his newly established credentials, so to speak, he may be in a situation to tempt Jesus more than anyone else respecting what's coming. The second contextual point to be recalled is that when we get to the end of the story, by which time Peter has dropped the ball a number of times again, Jesus has effectively left him in charge of things. Even after all his mistakes, and even after his more profound, arguably treasonous denials of Jesus the night before his crucifixion, Jesus has put his trust in him. And whether or not one believes in the strong interpretation of this commission favored by the Roman Catholic Church, it's clear from the way Acts unfolds that a transformed Peter, bold enough to speak out on Pentecost and eventually to face crucifixion himself, is unquestionably in charge and a witness to be reckoned with. So the sharp rebuke from Jesus is not at least the end of his story. So what is it that Peter got wrong in today's gospel story? Is he wrong not to have figured it out already, how the story is going to play out afterward? Or is he wrong just not to have trusted Jesus implicitly? Or is it something else? I think the first option is a little too facile, because the target is too remote. It's almost impossible for anyone to have envisioned accurately how this was going to play out. The second pardon me. The second option, though, may be at least as problematic. I think it's entirely wrong to take this as a litmus test of blind faith, much the way some fundamentalists today profess adherence to whatever the scriptures said, whether they understand it or not. I don't think that's what Jesus wants of us, and I don't think it's what he wanted from Peter. I don't think Jesus wanted Peter just to nod uncomprehendingly and say, "Right, boss, whatever you say." As a teacher, I can say that there's not a lot I find as annoying or hard to deal with as having a student merely capitulate when you're trying to clarify something. It's not buying any further adherence or compliance or anything else from the student. It's merely a recalcitrant student's way of disengaging from the discussion without taking responsibility for what it means. Got coffee here. Who wants to win or even lose a disagreement on those terms? Surely that's not what Jesus was looking for. I think the takeaway here is the harder thing. Jesus is telling Peter that his whole way of thinking, his way of understanding the world and life and everything in it, needs to be overhauled. In the short run, I think he is telling Peter not to presume to make decisions for him, Jesus, when he doesn't have any idea what is entailed. It's not that he has been insufficiently compliant. It's that he presumes to act on the basis of a dangerously incomplete understanding. But he is capable of being reoriented toward the truth. The redirection happens in stages over the rest of the narrative. Even after this alarming rebuke, Peter doesn't abandon the idea of resisting Jesus' actual mission. When Jesus is taken in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter is still trying to fight back with a sword, cutting off a slave's ear. Jesus, and one can imagine a certain amount of exasperation in the process, patiently puts the ear back on and tells Peter once again to stand down. But Peter does learn. It's a long haul, and there are many missteps yet to come, but he learns. And perhaps this is where the story intersects with the two reflections of the calling of Abraham. The recognition of God in our lives always will be a compelling and transforming thing. It will remake us, and it is remarkable. And yet, it is a relational kind of remaking. It is a sudden transformation, but itself incomplete. In other words, we may turn a corner, but turning a corner, even in a street, is just changing the direction your nose is facing. For those who know turtle geometry, Art, Fred, just turning your turtle doesn't actually accomplish anything. It's only meaningful in relation to what happens then. Changing which way you're facing doesn't actually take you to a different destination. One has to go forward from there to make a change of direction meaningful, and that is likely to take time. Abraham has emerged from this transition, and he's transformed, as Peter was, by a new realization of by faith, not by anything he has himself accomplished. And yet, in one of those weird ironies of the faith, it becomes entirely wrapped up with what he can accomplish too. Amen.